Hello, and welcome back to AASA, the School Superintendent Association's Public Education Policy Podcast, or PEP Talk for short. I am Kat Sturdevant, the AASA Advocacy and Governance Coordinator, and your host for each episode. So, the American Rescue Plan spending deadline is quickly closing in, as everyone is aware. And at AASA, we've been busy catching up with our members to produce our fifth and final ARP spending report, which released on September 9th. So we thought we'd do an episode on it. So without further ado, let's get to the episode.
Hi, I'm Sasha Pudelski. I'm the Director of Advocacy for AASA, the School Superintendents Association, and it's been my distinct pleasure for the last 14 or so years to represent superintendents on Capitol Hill.
It's finally here, Sasha, the fifth and final edition of our American Rescue Plan report. This is our fifth report spanning 3 years, cataloging how school administrators spent their ARP dollars in their district. Briefly, before we get into the results, let's talk about why our team wanted to take on this task of reporting expenditures and what the aim of the report is.
So, ARP represents the greatest investment in public education in American history. And ASA, as an organization that believes money matters in education, we wanted to track how districts plan to spend the dollars and how they eventually did spend the dollars. And so we started this back in July 2021, just a few months after the American Rescue Plan was passed, to start gathering information about what superintendents were thinking they would do with the dollars and how they were approaching addressing all the lost learning that resulted from the pandemic, as well as the significant needs, the trauma, the behavioral, the mental health needs that their students were experiencing. So once we knew districts had the money in pocket in January 2022, we did another survey saying, how are you thinking of deploying these funds and what does your community want you to spend these dollars on? And then we did a third survey in July of 2022, I think, that was really when we were able to get into, okay, what's the plan for spending these dollars? What obstacles are you experiencing in spending these funds? And then the next year, we could continue to dig into those questions as well as explore some of the sustainability ones that were top of mind. And that was in August of 2023. So we asked, how are you beginning to approach the fact that these funds are not going to last forever? How are districts addressing the sustainability issues with these funds? And then how are districts pivoting in spending their funds towards the end of the cycle? How are we determining the impacts of these dollars? And so we've taken a very comprehensive look, I think, from all sides, start to finish, about how this a massive amount of money has been implemented by districts.
What are some of the questions that we asked ASA members in this iteration of the survey?
So, this survey was interesting because compared to our other reports, when we asked how districts plan to spend the money in the next school year, this summer we asked them how they invested the funds in totality. So, when you step back and you add up all those AMP investments you made, what did you spend and how did you prioritize it? And what we found was kind of interesting. Respondents detailed spending in very similar categories like facilities and instructional time and mental health services. But there were enormous variations in the rate of spending in each of those categories. And that really reflects the reality of infusing a significant amount of funding into what we have in America, which is an extremely decentralized education system. And in retrospect, I think our quest to get some easily bulleted information about, oh, this many districts spent this much money on X, Y, and Z wasn't really realistic because when you think about the ARP statute, which again encouraged so much flexibility at the local level, and you remember, again, we have this super decentralized system. And then you remember on top of that, we have enormous differences in the amount of ARP funding that districts receive because it went out through the Title I formula. And then on top of that, we have very different needs of students that are making superintendents make different decisions about spending. It just wasn't practical to think we could get that information, though we certainly tried to. We did attempt to get data on the broader fiscal picture for the 24-25 school year to try and get a sense of the likelihood that ARP funding would be sustainable with local and state funding. And we also in this survey asked a lot of questions about what it was like, start to finish, to try and implement ARP funding and what seemed to work well and what didn't in the minds of superintendents.
And without further ado, let's get into the findings. So To top it off, what were the top 5 expenditures, and is anything different from our last iteration of this report?
So, in every single survey we've done, adding instructional time was the most prioritized expenditure, which has always made sense to me because, of course, when schools closed down, that's what kids missed out on the most. And this year was no different. Certainly, it was the top expenditure again. And therefore, I think the idea that you sometimes see in the media or in politicians here in Washington that addressing learning loss wasn't front and center simply is not true based on our data. Of course, it could look different in different communities. It could have looked like summer school. It could have looked like extended day programs. It could have looked like extended year programs, weekend programs.
Absolutely.
But that was really the top thing they focused on. And the second one was addressing mental health needs and behavioral needs and other physical, social, mental, whole child needs. And of course, that looked like investments in hiring, but it also looked like investments in professional development for your staff, in programming, in purchasing a curriculum. So that was right below instructional time was mental health. And then the third was buying tech and devices and providing kids with internet access and the ability to do their schoolwork at home. And this was certainly something that we know districts also spent ESSER 1 and ESSER $2 on, but again, still became a significant expenditure with these American Rescue Plan funds. The fourth was high intensity tutoring. And that surprised me because it is really challenging to stand up high intensity tutoring programs in many places. So I was surprised to see 2/3 of districts indicating that they really prioritize trying to do tutoring. And finally, renovations in school facilities to improve air quality and conditions for learning came in fifth because at the end of the day, most places you can't have summer programs in your school without an AC system. And similarly, you can't prevent the spread of an airborne virus without things like windows that open and functional HVAC systems and facilities that are not welcoming or that don't feel safe for kids means that we lose them in terms of attendance. We also lose educators when we have facilities that are kind of yucky and don't feel good to be in. And so taking this one-time funding and really investing in facility improvements was a common theme that we saw throughout our reporting, whether that looked like really doing major renovations to kind of reconfigure classrooms from 100 years ago to suit modern learning, or investing in more STEM programming and CTE classrooms and labs, or just generally getting back on track when it came to a lot of deferred maintenance. Those were all things that districts did.
So, with all that in mind, how did superintendents feel about this September 2024 deadline that was set for them? And what are some of the challenges they had in order to comply with this deadline?
Yeah, great question. So, even back in 2022, our survey data revealed that nearly half of superintendents were worried about this September's deadline to obligate funds. Now, fast forward to the summer, we don't see half of districts worried anymore. We just see about 15% of our respondents indicating that they are going to need to utilize a process through the US Department of Education known as late liquidation to make sure they can spend their dollars beyond January 2025. Every district has to obligate the funds by September 30th, but you have a little bit more time to liquidate them. But for some of these districts, they need more than just January 2025. Maybe they have experienced procurement issues, which maybe are not front page news anymore, but are still really complicating things, particularly facility work in districts. They might be just experiencing supply chain delays. Inflation certainly played a part. A lot of districts had to rescope projects as a result of that. So that led to delays. But generally, I'm relieved to see that it's only 15% that are going to need late liquidation, and that most of the districts are telling us that they only needed to spend down 10% or less of their funds. It's not like they have half of their funds that haven't been liquidated yet. So it's still tricky, of course, for them, not knowing whether they're going to get approval for the extra time. Ed has started to grant that approval right now to a few states. Many states haven't officially submitted yet or been approved yet. And so for districts in those states, they're in a little bit of limbo without this firm approval.
Is there anything in the report that surprised you, or are we so in tune with our members that we sort of knew what these results were going to look like?
I definitely think we're very in tune with our members, but there were a few things that surprised me. Superintendents don't usually come to tell me when things are working great, of course. More often, it's when things aren't working well. So I was surprised by the grades that they gave the US Department of Education and state education agencies. We asked them to evaluate their work distributing and implementing the funds, and 46% of our members said they would rate them good, which was way higher than I expected, given, again, what I hear from our members. But I'm not at all surprised by the complaints about what they didn't like about ARP, because those were made clear over and over again to us. The fact that concrete guidance on ARP came out a year after the spending was distributed was a pretty big pain point, because it left
Right.
districts that wanted to move quickly in a lurch. Superintendents indicated they wished there was more flexibility in using the funds. They complained a lot about how there was conflicting guidance about how funds could be spent, and long waits to receive funds and reimbursement approvals, and different definitions and different approval processes in states. Templates for just getting reimbursement were complicated. The reporting on top of that for the state and federal level was a huge issue. But I would say that the biggest gripe I heard was that the funds were distributed using the Title I formula, because we know from many years at AASA now, and in trying to solve this problem at the federal level, that the Title I formula really disadvantages small and rural schools, because it puts too much weight on the number of students in poverty rather than the percentage of students in poverty. And while, of course, we know that they had to pick a formula to distribute these dollars, until we have a more accurate Title I formula that is really going to lead to equity in terms of the distribution of dollars, it wasn't the formula that we would have wanted to use to distribute all of these ARP funds, because it led to a lot of discrepancies at the local level.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question. If you had to pick what formula you would use, do you have something in mind?
That's a great question too. I don't. I mean, I think that really we have to do this based on, poverty at the end of the day. And I think that the Title I formula generally, as a concept of a formula is a good one. It's just the mechanics of it, again, really disadvantage some of our rural districts or smaller districts that are high poverty. And so I think that, again, just having it go out with a better Title I formula, if there's another emergency funding package sometime, or any kind of funding that goes out, is really important. And I wish there was another way of trying to evaluate the needs of a community during the pandemic, but we don't have another option. I think that really makes sense based on what we know.
So speaking of funding, as a result of this historic funding that we've received, is there going to be a movement at the state or federal level to compensate for the gap it will leave?
No, it doesn't appear so. And certainly, where we are with federal funding right now, we're expecting, if we're lucky, level funding for our key two programs, Title I and IDEA, right now. So I was happy to see, based on our responses, that the sky is not falling in some ways. There is a fairly mixed picture in terms of funding levels at the state and local level. That said, 60% of our members reported that because they are expecting either level funding or decreases at both the local and state level, they don't have the ability to absorb some of the ARP cuts without making significant cuts elsewhere. Now, I want to be clear, it doesn't mean that you're getting there. We have a lot of members who are experiencing cuts at the state level and at the local level. It was more like they were experiencing it at the state level or at the local level. And again, that's better than in both places. But the state picture isn't as bad. But at the same time, certainly when we think about sustainability, and districts knew this was likely going to happen and planned accordingly, thankfully, there was the understanding that some of these programs, as wonderful as they were not going to last beyond even the 23-24 school year, or certainly this school year. So I think that it's critical that Congress step up and continue to provide the funding that districts need, but I don't anticipate them doing that in the near future.
Do you think when Congress looks at the spending from the American Rescue Plan, what districts provided that they spent the money on, would you say that Congress will say they spent the money well?
Well, someone told me very early on, when these funds were being distributed, that it didn't matter how districts spent the money, because Democrats had already decided the money would be well spent, and Republicans already decided that the money wouldn't be well spent. And there's probably an ounce of truth to that. But I do think that there are reasonable policymakers who genuinely want to know how these expenditures worked, and what was accomplished through this massive investment. But unfortunately, I think that only communities individually can kind of see that. I don't think you can look at how a state necessarily did, or how even a variety of districts within a state did, and make a determination, unless they spent it on one very specific thing, like they spent all their money on high dosage tutoring. Well, I guess then you can evaluate based on looking at test scores whether or not that investment made sense. But the reality is there was such, again, variation. And unlike other federal spending programs, there was this requirement in ARP for community buy in. And as this report clearly documents, communities had different spending priorities for ARP and different methods for using these dollars to meet their goals. So, truly, how do you determine that, for example, a community or district that prioritized, mental health over tutoring or facilities over teacher professional development spent the money better or worse than their colleagues? You certainly can't just look at how test scores and say, well, the test scores went up here, well, then therefore they spent the money well. I mean, if again they were laser focused on instruction, sure, maybe that would be appropriate. But if you're looking at things that are going to have a much longer return on investment, a delayed return on investment in some ways, like facility projects or like investing in social and emotional health or in professional development for teachers, those things are not going to show up immediately. And so when you look at some of the research that's been done, there was a paper by the Education Recovery Scorecard this summer, another one by the Calder Institute that has a lot of information about how districts, even with similar academic goals, structure programs very differently. What you find is that it's extremely difficult for anyone to definitively say there was a best way to spend the COVID relief money. And so it's a tough question for policymakers to answer. Whether, quote unquote, it worked or not is really going to be very individualized.
Much like a lot of things with the pandemic, it's going to take years and years for us to understand even just the impact of what this has left. And it's certainly probably going to be an area of study for many years for education scholars.
Definitely, definitely. I think research really needs to catch up and figure out other ways. Relying on test scores to determine effectiveness is a lazy approach in my mind. I think it's not nuanced enough, and so it's definitely it requires, I think, the policy and research community to step up and start measuring how other investments in our students and in our educators and in our buildings are all paying off in order for us to really get a good sense of what ARP did and what it didn't.
I'm going to pivot back to the obligation deadline for ARP.
Mhm.
If districts had one more year to spend these funds, what did the report find that they would have invested these dollars in?
That's important that you went back to that because at the beginning we asked them, do you need more time? And the answer, as I mentioned earlier, was yes, yes, yes. But this survey, we asked them specifically, would you have liked more time? Now, liking more time, needing more time, those are wanting more time. There are differences there, right? But 48% of our respondents said, yes, we really would have liked another year to invest our ARP funding. We got it done, but it would have been beneficial to have another year with the same amount of funding that we have. And that's because we have clunky systems in some ways at the state and at the local level that require a lot of hoops to be jumped through before you can spend dollars. And some of that really led to delays in terms of getting these dollars spent. But it also required, districts to make quick decisions. And that's just not something we're always good at doing in the education space. I know a lot of districts did pivot and they decided, after trying X, we're going to try Y instead. We're not getting the feedback that it's working. And they did do that and we documented that. But it wasn't easy for others, either because of the amount of dollars they received. Maybe they received too few dollars to pivot, or just because of time. And so when we asked that question about if you could have more time, what would you spend it on, that you were getting at is that really mental health supports came out as the top use of these dollars, which I think really undergirds what we already know, that the mental health crisis for our kids is very real. It has not ended in any way. The need for these counselors and school mental health personnel, our school psychs, our school social workers is critical. And we're not stepping away from those needs anytime soon to pivot to other things. We really need to address those underlying mental health needs to keep kids engaged and able to focus on learning. Other answers that we got were that districts would have liked to use their ARP funds to invest more in infrastructure projects, which makes sense. We also had 20% say that they would have used it to provide additional instructional programming, like continuing their summer school programs or after school programs. And 17% said they would have used the funding to support programs to combat chronic absenteeism. And that's one of those other things where I think there was a lot of surprise last school year at how widespread the chronic absenteeism problem was, how it wasn't really unique to certain communities. It was experienced all over the place, and how more resources were really needed to address that specifically. Well, if you had planned to spend some of your ARP funds on other things, it may not have been easy to pull dollars away and repurpose it for that. But I think the fact is, if we had more time to spend, districts would have had that flexibility to move things around a little bit more and to spend them more effectively at the end of the day.
Absolutely. I'm going to start to kind of take us home a bit. I want to
Mhm.
ask who will be most impacted by the end of ARP? What are district leaders saying about the impact?
We typically would assume that students in poverty would be the most impacted by all of these additional resources, especially since the funding went out through Title I. But what I found interesting in our surveys responses, both this year and last year, was that superintendents identified that they felt not just students in poverty would benefit significantly from this, but that all students in their system would benefit significantly from ARP funding, and that they did benefit from ARP funding as a group. Because I think, again, when you look at how programming for summer schools or additional personnel in the classroom, those programs were not just operated to help kids who were in poverty or kids with disabilities or another subgroup. They were operated to help any kid who needed it. And therefore, they were open to any child. So, teacher, the extra teacher or reading specialist was there to help the high income kids and the low income kids if they were struggling with literacy. So, a lot of these investments we made really did make a huge difference for the entire community of kids that we serve. And I think that when we look at the subgroup that really is going to be impacted by the expiration of ARP funds, after we acknowledge that all kids will be impacted significantly, it was students who had mental health needs that would be the most impacted, according to our responses to the survey.
Are there any final thoughts that I could ask you to share?
I guess I would just continue to urge superintendents to talk about the value of this investment, talk about how you spent it, how you measured the effectiveness of the dollars. There's still a lot of people who think districts didn't really have a lot of thoughtfulness when it came to this. They just spent it on things that were easy to spend on. And, now the money's gone and they're crying because they didn't plan well about the dollars not it lasting forever. I know that's not true. But that is still some of the rhetoric on Capitol Hill. It's some of the reasons why Republicans are suggesting we don't need as many title dollars right now because districts, should still be flush with cash. Some districts didn't spend it all. So why give extra Title I IDEA dollars? So I would just encourage superintendents to really continue the storytelling that you're doing. Talk to your local news media, talk to your parents, talk about the successes. We always say there's not enough people writing about all the great things happening in public schools. I've been hearing it my whole career at AASA. Well, you are the person best positioned to tell the story of how successful this massive investment in ARP was as a superintendent. So let's do that. Let's make sure that your parents and students and community members and population around you realize the power of having this additional funding and what it bought and what it accomplished for kids. And yes, we may not be at pre-pandemic levels, but it did a lot of other things that was cruelly needed. We need more investment, not less, as a result of this funding. So that, I think, is the biggest message I'd like to relay to our soups.
I love ending with something actionable. So thank you so much for sharing that. This has been a pleasure to have you on, Sasha. Thank you for talking about the report. I'm going to have the report linked in the show notes and including our September edition of The Advocate to talk about the ARP report. And with that, we'll sign off. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kat.
And that's a wrap on this episode of AASA's PEP Talk podcast. We invite you to share it by using the hashtag PEP Talk on Twitter. You can access past episodes in the PEP Talk library by visiting aasapeptalk.podbean.com. And once again, thank you for joining us.